And we welcome you and everyone to another edition of our Lennox on Baseball live stream podcast. Steve Lennox with you today. Follow us on Twitter at Lennox on Baseball. Like and follow our Facebook page as we continue to build and going forward. We're going to talk with Bill Daughtry today. Bill, longtime announcer, on-air talent in New York City. We're going to talk about his career in New York City baseball and a lot of different things today, and just kind of give you a background as we welcome in Bill. I've known Bill in terms of growing up and watching him on MSG, listening to him on WFAN radio in New York, and then in 2010, it was a great thrill to be able to be in the studio with him at 2 Penn Plaza with ESPN Radio, and at the time, ESPN 1050. Mr. Daughtry, it's great to see your smile. How are you, sir?
Steve, I'm doing wonderful this morning, and I hope everyone under the sound of our voice is doing the same.
Give us an idea. This is a question that I start off with, and when I, and I'll admit, I was in a little bit of awe, and I was certainly intimidated being in the studio with you and many others when I started at 1050 back in 2010 doing updates and stuff, But our conversation's got in the direction of baseball, and that's something that you've always, you've been involved with in different ways over the years, and we'll get into that. But the question I sort of start off with, and it jumpstarts the conversation, is: at what point did you start following the game of baseball and perhaps developing that love affair with the game?
I've been a baseball fan, watcher, player, whatever you want to call it, since about the age of 7 or 8 years old. When I was growing up in New York City, in Harlem, I thought the Yankees were a team that basically hosted the World Series every year. In other words, they just picked a team to come and play the Yankees. But we found out in 1963 that wasn't necessarily the case. And then you really got a grip on it in 1965 when they weren't in the World Series for the first time in my lifetime.
Did you grow up as a Yankee fan?
I wouldn't say that. My parents separated when I was 11. So weekends meant my father would come and pick me up, and we would go to a baseball game. So we saw Yankees, we saw Mets. I was just on a forum last night for one of my hobbies, a Stratomatic forum, and someone was talking about the Mets in the old Polo Grounds, and a lot of people don't realize that was the Mets' home for their first 2 years of existence. And I mentioned in that conversation that I was thankful that my father was one of those. I'll never set foot in said stadium because no, we went everywhere. We went and we watched Mets, we watched Yankees. I remember one summer going down to visit some of his family in Baltimore. Actually took in a doubleheader at Old Memorial Stadium in Baltimore. It was the Orioles and the White Sox, as a matter of fact. And I will never forget, how you get yearbooks, and I guess now we call it landscape. Well, this was a portrait yearbook that was about 1.5 feet tall. Brooks Robinson on the cover, and I still remember him in that pose, in his defensive pose at third base. So, now I've been a baseball fan just about all my life, although I must say they are struggling to keep my fandom in the last few years.
We'll touch on that, but a memory. There's actually something on social media now. It's a picture where dad and son are walking up the tunnel. And now there's a lot of the ballparks redesigned in the new stadiums. You're sort of out on that out on the promenade, and you can see out onto the field. But can you sort of paint the picture, whether it was Memorial Stadium in Baltimore or one of the New York ballparks, where you walked up that tunnel and you saw that field for the first time?
Oh yeah, I mean, it's not just seeing it; it's the smell of the building, it's the smell of the grass, and it's kind of surreal. You walk through this, for lack of a better word, a tunnel with a hole at the end of it, and as you get closer, you see less sky and more green, more brown. Then all of a sudden you see players on the field doing their thing. If you're lucky enough to get there for batting practice, the nets are up, the cage is up, and it's quite the experience. And again, it's very sensory. It's more than just the sight. It's the sound, It's the smell. It's just something that is unique to baseball that you don't get in any other game.
You mentioned, in the sense, Bill, of, losing your fandom over the last couple of years. What's led you to that?
A couple of years ago, I'm watching the Mets and Dodgers play at Citi Field. I remember this play very vividly. Neil Walker was at first base, and it was a ground ball hit somewhere in the infield. And of course, Chase Utley was involved in this play. This is after the playoff fiasco. But anyway, you know, Chase Utley on a ground ball in the infield, Neil Walker takes him out at second base. And all of a sudden, there's a conversation about, was this a legal slide? It's like, really? Are you kidding me? I've been watching baseball all my life. I've been involved in baseball. I've taken out a few guys at second base. And it just seemed that the whole thing got convoluted. I mean, it was a simple forced play at second. Neil Walker came in with a hard slide to break up the play. And from that point on, it's like, what am I watching? And now you do this to Walker guy. You had the Tatis stuff the other day. I mean, what am I watching? Batista flipping the bat in a vengeful way, dude. I don't know. I don't know what's happening to this game now.
Is there a fine line for you in terms of, gamesmanship, showing up your opponent, and also, as they say, let them have fun, let them play?
I'm all about letting them have fun. I'm all about letting them play. But particularly in the case of Batista, and we got into this argument many times on ESPN with Han and Humpty and Chris Canty and all my guys over there, who, by the way, I'm still in regular contact with. We talk all the time, at least once or twice a month. What Batista did, that was cardinal sin, man. It's like, okay, you hit your home run, you won the game, you're elated, you're happy. And you know what? If he had just thrown the bat in the air, but he looks directly into the Ranger dugout and like, really? Oh no, dude, you're gonna pay for that. You're gonna pay for that. And he ultimately did, as we all saw the fight ensue later in the series. Look, I get old school, and I remember, and even on occasion saw some of the stories. Bob Gibson and Don Drysdale. I'm old enough to see those guys pitch. I get all that. I understand, and I understand it was a very different game then. But I keep going back to the Batista thing because, again, why didn't he just point in the dugout and flip the bird at him and then swing his bat in that? I mean, come on, man. He crossed the line and he had to pay for it. And Odor made him pay for it at some point because he knocked the what out of him. The other night, this Tatis thing. I said, really? This is what we're doing here? Okay. It's a 10-0 game. I get it. The last time I checked, this is Major League Baseball. And you can look at teams that have had 7, 8-run innings, leads get away, things go bananas. Well, I mean, it's 3-0. Bases are loaded. You don't want this guy to hit? Well, in today's baseball, all you got to do is this. But instead, no, they throw the pitch. They throw a pitch. They're trying to get him out. And so he says, no, I like this pitch, and swings. And it goes over the wall. It's a home run. Now it's 14-3 or whatever the score was, and everybody's losing their mind. Like, really? The pitcher was trying to get him out. What is he supposed to submit? Make a pitch. Look, first of all, you got in a 3-0 hole. So, I mean, now you're going to decide that, well, let me try and get him out. Really? And he's supposed to just stand there? I don't think so. I don't agree with that at all. So, again, it's a different game. It's not like you willfully stole a base like what he did the next night when it was 6-0 and he steals third. It's a different kind of scenario. But again, it's just a signal that, hey, the game is different. The game has changed, and some of the changes I'm not feeling.
You mentioned the two, and they're probably two or the 3 or 4 guys that, and I never saw him play, but reading plenty of books and different things over the years. You mentioned Bob Gibson, Don Drysdale. Those two guys when they got the justice or they got back for doing something like that, and over the years, hitters, Drysdale would say, don't even dig in, don't dig in against me or you're going to be on your backside. What was it like watching those style of pitchers growing up?
Well, first of all, forget the intimidator part. They were great pitchers. They were great pitchers. Bob Gibson was one of those who perfected the slider early in his career. Just look at the pitch that he threw to Willie Horton and Norm Cash in the World Series. He froze them both. Bob Gibson was an outstanding pitcher, and Drysdale also equally outstanding. Everybody raves about Sandy Koufax, but Don Drysdale won Cy Young before Koufax. He won 25 games in a season before Koufax. He had the consecutive shutout innings record. So while they have this reputation as intimidators, dude, they were damn good pitchers. I often think about Juan Marichal. Consider this. Juan Marichal won 26 games one season, no Cy Young Award. 25 games another season, no Cy Young Award. 21 games in another season, no Cy Young Award, because some guy named Koufax was winning everything.
Right.
People don't realize Juan Marichal pitched close to 300 innings in minor league baseball before he ever stepped on a major league field and threw a pitch. So, I mean, these guys really worked at their craft. They understood the game, and they took it to a level where they could really hone in and drill down and do some very unique things on the baseball diamond.
Who did you enjoy listening to on the radio when you were growing up?
Mel Allen, Red Barber, Lindsey Nelson. I got to know Ralph Kiner later on. I mean, those were the people, because when I was, growing up, there was no sports talk radio. Your sports talk radio was your baseball game, was your football game. Marty Glickman and Al DeRogatis, one of the finest play-by-play teams ever on radio. Now it's a lot of cookie cutter, particularly on TV, and that's not to disparage anybody that's doing it, but there's a lot of sameness there. When I was growing up, you had unique voices, unique personalities, and that's something that we don't have so much now.
Can you touch on the relationship as to how you got to know Ralph Kiner?
I was working at WGCH radio in Greenwich, Connecticut, and there was a state senator. His name was Mike Morano, and WGCH was one of those sound of your life radio stations that served the immediate community. And so Mike Morano came to the station one day to tape something, and over the years I built a relationship with him. And he says, "Hey, I'm going to lunch with Ralph. You want to come?" Boy, do I. And we went to some Italian restaurant and had a great lunch. And that was the beginning of knowing Ralph Kiner. I even remember his old license plate. He used to drive a Chrysler. And the license plate was Homer 4, which was his number when he played with Pittsburgh Pirates over years ago. So, he was an engaging gentleman. Always had a baseball story to tell, and had a pretty colorful career as things go. And, his favorite story was going in to see Branch Rickey to talk about a raise after he had one of those uber homer seasons. And Rickey told him, "Hey, we finished last with you. We can finish last without you." So much for the raise.
Do you think he got his just due as an announcer with the Mets? I mean, as a former player, he did both. He was the analyst, but he was also a play-by-play guy as well. And then, of course, Kiner's Corner. Do you think he got his due as an announcer?
I mean, say no more. Kiner's Corner. I mean, that was groundbreaking stuff, man. At the time, pardon me, you had a guy who played the game, who knew the players and managers and the coaches, and then after the game, he'd get those guys to come in. And most of the time, it was a visiting team, because the Mets stunk in those days, and they'd be getting clocked every night. So you got to see some of the great players in the game in a one-on-one atmosphere with Ralph. His just due. I tell you what, when he passed away a few years ago, all you were seeing were clips of Kiner's corner, more so than any
Yeah.
play-by-play, any analysis. He was also general manager out in San Diego in the PCL. He was just a great guy. He did a lot of things. He's involved in the players union. He fought for equality. Ralph Kiner he was my kind of guy. He's a good dude.
From the 60s through the 70s and into the 80s. We'll start with those decades as we got closer and closer to more games being on TV, the formation of sports radio as it became about in the 1980s with FAN. When did it, today, I mean, you can watch 3-4 games on TV. You can do different packages and stuff like that. But back then it was, you knew where the Mets and Yankees were going to be, but you didn't necessarily had the game of the week, but that's how you sort of started to get to learn other teams, other individuals, other players.
Game of the week was the vehicle that I learned the Cardinals and the Dodgers, and to a lesser degree the Giants, because we always followed the Giants as much as you could follow them back in those days. Because again, Willie Mays is still to this very second the greatest player I've ever seen. No disrespect to Trout. Ken Griffey is right there behind Willie. I call Willie 1 and Griffey 1A. So, I got a chance to see some of the greatest players that ever played this game. But the game of the week was a great vehicle, again, because I'm sorry, I'm not a. I'll steal a line from Stephen A. Smith. I'm allergic to scrubs. I'm not watching bad teams, man. I'm just not. And we were growing up in the beginning, the Yankees, like I told you, top of the conversation, it's World Series every year. The Mets, these guys are bums, and so there was a span when neither team was really good, and you kind of hung your hat on that game of the week because you were going to watch the locals get smashed every day or every night on Channel 9 or Channel 11, which is where you watched the Mets and Yankees back in the day. But the game of the week, you got to see the best players in the game being played at its highest level, so to speak, until you got to the World Series. So I was a big fan of game of the week, but I can remember when it started to be, I don't want to say overkill, but the game started to get oversaturated a little bit. And you're probably going to remember this night. I want to say mid 80s, late 80s. And on this particular night, both Fernando Valenzuela and Dave Stewart were pitching no-hitters. And you didn't get to see all of either game, but you got to see a significant part of both games. And I said, this is cool, but to me, a no-hitter is like you riding this thing out from start to finish, not parachuting in for bonus coverage, which is really what all sports have become now. It's I don't know, what are we, ADD or something? We can't sit and go through a 2.5, 3 hour event. No, we got to get a piece of this one. We got to get some of that one. And in basketball and football and hockey, there are natural breaks for that kind of thing to happen. But in baseball, you're there from start to finish. At least you hope to be there. So I understand it's what the culture is now. We have the technology to do this kind of stuff. Why waste it? But again, to me, that's when things really started to change.
And that's exactly what happened last night with me. It wasn't, I don't get updates on my phones or anything, but, casually on my phone going through it. And, White Sox pitcher Lucas Giolito's got that no-hitter going. And, I was able to find it. I didn't find it on my TV, but because I know right now I don't have the MLB network because of, the cable carrier and all that stuff. Won't even get into that. But, just finding, the radio call of it for the ninth inning. And I was there for, the last out in the eighth inning, and then the top of the ninth inning, and all the way to those 3 outs that he was able to get. With Willie Mays, moment or several moments that still all these years later for you in watching him, or was it just over the course of, the greatness of his career that, is where the respect comes in?
He was the one player who could beat you in any way that there was to beat you. He could get a base hit, he could hit a home run, he could steal a base, he could take an extra base, he could create chaos and mayhem on the base paths, and when it came to playing center field, there was none better. I mean, he went and he could go get it. He could make spectacular catches. He could make very, very common catches, even though the basket catch there was nothing common about it until you tried it and figured out just how difficult that was. I don't know if the people listening and watching understand. Roberto Clemente also used the basket catch, but the basket catch, most outfielders, they do this. Basket catch is at your waist, and you kind of let the ball fall in the basket. And that was, that's what Willie Mays did routinely in center field. But it wasn't just the basket catches. It was his ability to go and patrol both alleys with a great throwing arm and instinctively always knowing, I shouldn't say instinctively, because he was a student of the game. He played in the Negro Leagues, Birmingham Black Barons. They raised him literally, and taught him everything he knew about baseball along with his dad. So, I mean, he was a guy who he knew the game inside out, and he had the physical ability to go with that knowledge. And that's why, to this day, to me, he's the greatest ever to play the game.
So, day after Giolito's no-hitter last night, I'm already hearing, this was one of the greatest performances ever for a pitcher, and it was outstanding. It was outstanding. But the day after, it's got to be the best ever. So, when there are comparisons to Willie Mays' present day, do you just sort of scoff at those?
No, because I don't think. I mean, first of all, it's a natural thing. I can remember being a young fella in the barber shop or sitting around a table with some older guys and raving about player X, Y, and Z, and they'll tell you, please, you haven't seen anything. You don't know what you're talking about. So, I mean, it's a generational thing. One of my best friends lives in Seattle, and we talk a couple of 3 times a week. And, he was in the airline business, and he always talks about, he runs into these young guys who want to say player X, Y, or Z currently playing is the greatest ever. And the question is, well, what is your ever? Who have you seen play? You've seen 5 guys play in your whole life, and you're going to crown one as the best ever. What about the hundreds that came before him? So that's a natural thing. And, when people want to hold Steve Trout up as the greatest of all time, okay, that's fine. That's what you know. That's what you saw. That's the greatest of your time. But I saw Mays, I saw Griffey, and to me, they are 1 and 1A. We were having a similar conversation in basketball. People were talking about Joel Embiid. I said, are you kidding me? Wilt Chamberlain is still to this day. You can have LeBron. You can have go down the list. Anybody you want. Luka, the Greek Freak, whoever you. None of those guys is as good as Wilt. You go back and you look at what Wilt was doing when he was at Kansas. You go back and look what Wilt did when he played with the Globetrotters for 1 year. Those guys can't do that. They can't. And Wilt, never mind the 100-point game, averaging 50 in a season. Really, he was the greatest.
Whenever those topics come up, is like, imagine Wilt Chamberlain or Willie Mays or anyone from those different eras of all the things a player have, the accommodations they have today, the treatment, not just an ice bag and a 12-ounce beer. It's an hour after the game of the stint, all the different things that they go through, even just the travel. You put those guys in the situation, I think it elevates them almost even more.
All of these guys can play. You can take the greatest players from any sport in any era, and if you put them into 21st century professional sports, they'd still be great. They would still be great. That's what a lot of people don't get about pro sports. I don't care what sport you're talking about. The people that play for pay were the best on their block. They were the best in their town, the best in their school, the best in their state. You get the natural progression here. I mean, and that's all of the people who play professional sports. So now you're taking the best of the best and you're lumping them together. And the best of that group, clearly the best ever to play any of these games.
At what point early on were you introduced to the history of the Negro League?
That's a great question. I actually saw a Negro League game. I don't know if it was barnstorming or what it was, but I have some pictures at the old Yankee Stadium that my father took, and you can't make out who it is, but you can clearly see the coaches are black, everybody on the field is black, and the uniforms aren't the recognizable major league livery. So we've seen that, and over the years, I had the opportunity to talk to, interact with some Negro League players. But to directly answer your question, I want to say back in the early 80s was when I really started. I always knew about the Negro Leagues, but back in the early 80s is when I started to look in just a little deeper and got to tell you a quick story. When I was in college, I had a girlfriend. I went to State University in New York at Albany. And my girlfriend was from Albany, and she lived off campus. And, weekends we would go to her house and spend time with her family. And I clearly remember sitting in their living room watching the 1971 National League playoffs between the Pirates and the Giants with her father. I had no knowledge of him being anything but Mr. Walker. How are you, sir? Blah, blah, blah. And found out years later after he had passed that he was Edsel Walker, who was a Negro League All-Star pitcher with Pittsburgh and Baltimore back in the mid and late 30s. And he never ever let on while this young whippersnapper sat there in his living room and tried to show him the greatness of what he knew about baseball. But Edsel Walker, uh, Robert Smith, I'm sorry, Robert Scott, who lived not far away from me here in New Jersey. I got to meet him many years ago. Another Negro League pitcher, pitched for the Black Yankees many years back. You hear the stories about Satchel Paige and Josh Gibson, and here's what I've learned. I still play a game called Stratomatic Baseball. A lot of people know what I'm talking about. And this year, to observe the 100th anniversary of the Negro Leagues, they put out a 8-team set. They call them Diamond Gems. And there were teams in there, the Cleveland Buckeyes from 1945. We know about the Birmingham Black Barons. We
Yeah.
know about the Crawfords. We know about the Homestead Grays. We know about the Kansas City Monarchs. And we had a chance to, they were only cards, they were inanimate objects, but you had a chance to interact on a certain level with some of the greats of the game. And the takeaway from this was there were a number of players in the Negro Leagues who could have been all-star level players in the major leagues. The league on the whole, the 1 to 25 man rosters, no, they couldn't compete with major league teams, and it was a matter of the resources that were involved in the era. But there were players on those 1 to 25 man rosters, or 1 to 20 as it was, or even less in the case of many teams. There were a handful of players there that could have easily been major league all stars. And it was going back and uncovering the stories, learning about the talents and the abilities of people. The Indianapolis ABCs, they had, oh my goodness, back at, I think it was 22, they had a spectacular team. led by Oscar Charleston, who was a native of Indianapolis. So he was, in his prime, playing for his hometown, and had an incredible season. A truly great player, and one
Referred
of,
to
as I
as Willie
said,
Mays before Willie
yeah,
Mays almost.
yeah. Oscar Charleston he was a guy who also later in his career played first base and played it very well, even pitched on occasion. So as great a hitter as you're going to find anytime, anywhere in any league, and an outstanding defender. So learning about these players, learning these stories, learning about these people and what their experience was, it was eye-opening to me. A gentleman named Don Ragosin, back in the early 80s, wrote a book about the Negro Leagues. And the name of this book escapes me at this very moment. I think of Baseball's Invisible Men, Life in the Negro Leagues. It was an extremely revealing book. And even though it was almost 40 years ago, you still get an excellent recreation of what that life was like. And now, unfortunately, most of those men are gone. Passage of time, all things change. But it was great reading it and learning about it, and to see Stratomatic do what they did this year with proceeds from the sales of those sets going to the Negro League Museum in Kansas City. It was a special experience.
Have you ever been out to Kansas City and seen the
Yes,
museum?
Yes, I had a very, very unique view of the Negro League Museum when we were working with Madison Square Garden many years ago. Ken Singleton was a part of the Yankee broadcast
Yeah.
team. People who know me know what I'm about to say, but I've known Ken Singleton since I was 10 years old, because his brother and I were 1 year apart. Fred Singleton, a great track coach in Westchester County at White Plains High School. Fred and I were 1 year apart. It's Fred who introduced me to Stratomatic, by the way. And they lived, are you ready for this? They lived in the house that was owned by the Branca family. They
Okay.
lived in the same house on Seneca Avenue. When the Brancas sold their house, the Singletons bought it. Think about that, in Mount Vernon, New York. So I've known Kenny since I saw him play American Legion ball, Bronx Federation ball, Mount Vernon High School ball. I've known him for a very long time, and we're still good friends to this day. But long story short, we were with the Yankees in Kansas City. We were doing a series with the Royals, and Kenny says, we're going to the Negro League Museum. And he and I went, and to this very day, I still remember the opening exhibit. When you walk through the door, I don't know if you've ever been there before, but when you walk through the door, you see this field, and it's a chicken wire fence around the field. And then at each of their positions are statues of
Yeah.
the greatest Negro League players. They're in action positions, and Buck ONeil is the manager, and it's just like it's a sight to behold. It really is.
Did you ever interview or cross paths with Buck ONeil?
Yes, I did. Yes, I did. Many years ago, a good friend of mine, I was telling you before we went on, that this is a different kind of day for me because I have to go to New York City to do an event. Good friend of mine, his name is Ed Sterling. He is at Signature Bank in New York City. He's a vice president. And many years ago, when he was with Citibank, he would do these small business luncheons, something that he has taken on to Signature. And I was fortunate that he asked me to be the MC of these luncheons. And over the years, I got to meet many people. And one of those people at one of the luncheons was Buck ONeil. And this was before Ken Burns' baseball made him this national
Mm-hmm.
celebrity. And he was every bit as delightful then as he was to that point. And I believe Joe Posnanski in Kansas City wrote a
Yeah.
book about Buck ONeil, which was a real eye opener when he talks about Billy Williams almost never had a major league career. Billy Williams, son of Mobile, Alabama, and in the South, and the minor league experience for black players in the South. Well, you can imagine what it was back then. Even up to the days of Richie Allen, it was brutal when he had to play in Little Rock, Arkansas for Frank Lucchese. You remember that name?
Mm,
But anyway, Billy
yep.
Williams was so discouraged and so despondent over the treatment and the grind and the rigors of the game, he almost walked away. And I believe it was Billy's mother or a close friend that called Buck to come and talk to Billy, to talk to him about, dude, you'd be making the biggest mistake of your life if you walked away from this game. The story is covered in Poznanski's book. And as we all know, Billy Williams came back and turned out to be one of the great Chicago Cubs, one of the great hitters, Hall of Famer, one of the great left-handed hitters of all time.
One thing that always sticks out for me in reading different books, and I'm going to go back to, I appreciate the recommendation. I'll add it to the list and try to find Don's book from the 1980s that you mentioned, is the fact that the barnstorming, and I think you mentioned barnstorming earlier, of Major League played in different cities, different towns against the Negro League players and the different groups that got together. They played against each other for years and years before 1947.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's just like today. Everybody knows where the talent is. As people say, game recognizes game. These guys knew each other. They all knew each other. They all played either together or against each other for many years, sometime in league settings, sometimes in non-league settings, sometimes in the Caribbean, because there were great opportunities for black ball players in the Caribbean. Even Trujillo down in Mexico and in Cuba, there were other opportunities. So, I mean, the experience of the black ball player throughout the years has just been a reflection of society's treatment of black people. You were not allowed to grow. You were not allowed to flourish. You were not allowed to feel good about yourself or anything that you did. You were this other, and you had no place in the major leagues just because you were this other. And it was one of the great injustices, one of many that has occurred to people of color in this country over the last 400 or 500 years. And the thing that always amazed me about Negro Leaguers, they had no bitterness. They weren't bitter about anything. Buck ONeil says it best, man. It's like we traveled as best we could and played in some of the greatest stadiums against some of the greatest people and rubbed elbows with some of the greatest people, all from our culture. We experienced the top of our culture. There was no experience greater than what we had, and for that, we're not at all bitter.
We'll close right there. I do appreciate you taking the time. Wish you all the best. And if you don't mind, I'd love to, let's maybe set a date for later on where we can maybe do this again and hear some of the wonderful stories that you shared today. Steve,
you've done well. I'm proud of you, man. You can call me anytime.
Thank you, sir. Enjoy the day. Best to you and the family, and we'll be in touch.
Same to you. Thanks, Steve.
That is Bill Daughtry. Outstanding person, wonderful talent, 45 years as an on-air person in New York City. And like I said, from the early 80s, mid 80s with WFAN, MSG, and just in 2010 being in New York and seeing Bill hosting for 1050 ESPN New York. And I was in the studio with him as an update anchor, and it was a T-shirt or it was a hat that he was one day, and it just sparked a conversation of baseball and an encyclopedia. And it's where you just did, and I've heard this before, of just sometimes you just let the person, you just let them tell the story. And Bill shared some great stories today. We'll be back with more Lennox on Baseball Thursday, Friday this week. Don't forget, follow us on Twitter @Lennox on Baseball. Enjoy the rest of your Wednesday, everybody. And thanks so much for all of your support.